Good morning, everyone. I've been given the signal. It's time to begin class. Welcome to those joining us online and those here in the building. I was thinking this morning, those of you that may remember the movie Good Morning Vietnam, Robin Williams. I don't have the timing and cadence, Good morning, Timberline! Something like that. Pretty good? Yeah, right. I'll be turning over to Ezekiel Chapter 11. That's where we're going to pick up again this morning. I want to finish some items from that chapter. There's just a couple of points I think are important to consider, so I'm going to go back and make sure we catch those, and then we'll move on this week into chapters 12 and 13. If things really work out, we'll even talk about 14. But I'm not optimistic I'll get that far, but I'm going to try. Remember from the end of class last week, as we were talking about chapter 11, a couple of the main points that we highlighted. In this particular chapter, Ezekiel is caught up in a vision, remember, in chapters 9, 10, 11, 8 through 11 actually. Caught up in a vision, going to Jerusalem, seeing all the rebellion that's taking place and the idolatry of the people. And in this particular chapter, God is emphasizing to Ezekiel, those rulers, those leaders in Jerusalem who think they're safe, they're going to be killed. The destruction is coming in punishment for their idolatry. And the other side of that coin is those in exile, trying to help them understand they are the true remnant, that God has brought them out to keep them safe so that ultimately they will be able to return to Him and then in time return to Jerusalem physically as well. So I want to read just a little bit this morning, starting in chapter 11, verse 14. And we'll begin there and have a few thoughts. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, the people of Jerusalem have said of your fellow exiles and all the other Israelites, they are far away from this Lord. Good morning. They are far away from the Lord. This land was given to us as our possession. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. But as for those whose hearts are devoted to their vile images and detestable idols, I will bring down on their own heads what they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. So in the latter part of those verses, we get to the point he's talking again about the remnant, those that are in exile. They're going to be returning at some point as they return to God spiritually, and then ultimately He'll return them to Israel physically. Important to point out, when they return, when they return, what are they going to do when they return to the promised land?
Remove the detestable things.
All those bad things. Remember chapter 8, all those imageries, the 4 different types of idolatry, or the 4 different instances of idolatry that Ezekiel was shown. Going to get rid of all that stuff. We're going to remove all the vile images, the detestable idols. And when they return, again, we've talked about this point before, and it's been made in other classes, kind of the outcome of the exile. We're going to see conversion. When you look at those verses, conversion, the people will have a new heart. New heart. Jeremiah talks about this as well. The relationship with God will be restored, at least in a sense. Okay? They've learned that their idolatry was very wrong. We don't need to go down that path. We need to return to the Father, return to God. And also included in this passage is the idea for those that refuse to change, they're still pending punishment. Okay? This is not a one-time deal, that the relationship must be maintained over time. But those that refuse to have their hearts and spirits renewed will have the reward that the idols can give them, which is nothing. Nothing. One commentator, in reading through a variety of sources, summarized kind of this section, I thought, in a very nice way. He said, by giving themselves over to God, the remnant among the captives could reclaim spiritual Israel and eventually physical Israel as well. Again, the idea of learning the lessons of the captivity, of the mistakes that they've made, that they can be renewed and returned from the condition they're in, which is certainly one they did not desire. Okay, let's go ahead and read the rest of this chapter. We'll finish it up. Then beginning in verse 22. Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. The Spirit lifted me up and brought me to the exiles in Babylonia in the vision given by the Spirit of God. Then the vision I had seen went up from me, and I told the exiles everything the Lord had shown me. So again, going back, this goes all the way back to chapter 8. Remember where we started last week. We have at this point the conclusion of this vision. And at least what I think of as a very sobering image, how it closes out the remnant of the glory of God leaving Jerusalem. Remember, if you will, from historical or other studies, when the temple was built, God choosing this city, choosing this place to have His presence. When the temple was filled with His glory, they saw it in a very real way. The people saw it in a very real way. But this is a vision. Okay, this is a vision, but Ezekiel sees the opposite of that, God leaving, God departing, His Spirit departing from this place, from the temple, from the city, because destruction is coming, that He is giving it up. Because of their rebellion, because of the idolatry that we had seen displayed in chapter 8. A lot of commentators have fun with details, and when you read these verses, He moved over the mountains of the east, or moved to the mountains east of Jerusalem. And if you're thinking about a map, okay, what's east of Jerusalem? Well, first, a lot, okay? There's a lot east of Jerusalem. But Babylon is one of the elements east of Jerusalem, so they like to make a lot of, God left the temple, left Jerusalem, and He's watching over them while they're in captivity, which is true, so nothing wrong with the idea. But there's a lot of mountains right around Jerusalem. A lot of distance between that and the mountains that you would find around Babylon. So that was just for free. I got a chuckle out of that when I read it. With some picking on the details that people love to have fun with. Okay. Then Ezekiel comes back and tells them what all has happened. Those in exile. One of these oddities about visions and people with him we mentioned last week, he was in the house with the elders. They had come to speak with him, and this vision came upon him. We have no idea what they were aware of or not, and have no idea the time of it. I was always curious. Okay, how long was it for him and the men sitting there? It could have been like that for them. He blanked out for a couple of seconds. I have no idea what it was like. But when he comes back, when he speaks to them at the conclusion of the vision, he had a lot to tell them. Probably not what they expected to hear when they came to see him that day, would be my guess. But just a guess. All right, let's go ahead and move on this morning. We're going to pick up in chapter 12 now. Put the title on this, Symbols and Sermons. No visions in this section. We have Ezekiel again. We'll be performing two acts, one symbolizing an escape from Jerusalem, or attempting to escape Jerusalem and its destruction, and then a second symbolizing the fear of the Jews, that they will experience the destruction of the city and the temple. In chapter 13, in the end of chapter 12, there's also a rebuke for those that fail to accept or believe God's judgment is coming. And that follows right on the tail in chapter 13. Chapter 13 follows that with condemnations of false prophets and false teachers. And so we'll talk about that. And if we get there in chapter 14, there's a criticism of the elders, of the leaders, of those who are in exile, that are also guilty of idolatry. Reminding them, hey, remember why you're here. And then also he closes that chapter with the certainty of Jerusalem's destruction. It's emphasized that this will happen. So let's begin in chapter 12, pick up, and we'll get the setting or this first action, the first part of it. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see, but do not see, and ears to hear, but do not hear, for they are rebellious people. Therefore, Son of man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime, as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place. Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious house. During the daytime, while they watch, bring out your belongings, pack for exile. Then in the evening, while they are watching, go out like those who go into exile. While they watch, dig through the wall and take your belongings out through it. Put them on your shoulder as they are watching and carry them out at dusk. Cover your face so you cannot see the land, for I have made you a sign to the house of Israel. So I did as I was commanded. During the day I brought out my things packed for exile. Then in the evening I dug through the wall with my hands. I took my belongings out at dusk, carrying them on my shoulders while they watched. Matt?
What's the symbolism behind digging through a wall? Is that just trying to get out to the quickest way possible? Or?
Well, give me a minute and we'll get there.
Okay.
No, it's actually, this is one of those visions, these symbols actually explain. God tells them to it. And we're going to see, looking at a parallel passage in Jeremiah, what most think this is referring to. And so it's going to...
I read it as you instructed, and I still don't get it.
Okay, we'll try to get it for you. The short answer is it's the destruction of the walls and them going out through the walls of Jerusalem. And so we'll see an actual instance where they did that.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll get there. Good question, though. Okay. So yeah, these symbolic elements are quite interesting. Because, during the day, get ready, pack up your belongings to go into exile. And it struck me, well, I've never gone into exile. What do you take? What do you pack up to go into exile? And back to Matt's question, where this is going to, we think, symbolize people fleeing Jerusalem. Okay, they're trying to get out because the city is under attack and they've been under siege and they just want to live. And so, it'd be quite a different scene from what we saw with the Exodus. Okay, when Israel left Egypt, this was a grand affair. It was like a huge undertaking. All these people and all their possessions and all of their belongings and the animals that would have gone with them. Well, packing for exile is going to be a little bit different. Basically you're on the run. Okay, you're trying to flee a situation and get away from it. So during the day he packs up so they see what he's doing, because then at night he's going to take off. Okay, he's going to take off. And to your point, your question, it mimics or symbolizes escaping. Okay, again, why digging through the wall? And I don't know what wall Ezekiel dug through. For some reason, most of the commentators think he's digging through the wall of his house. Maybe. I have no idea.
But they said that they said do it so they could see it.
So they could see it. Yeah, he's digging a hole. Yeah. I don't tend to think so either. Now, I don't know what wall was around their settlement, but I suspect there was probably one somewhere.
And you wonder if these communities and stuff like that were a whole lot more knitted tighter, you know what I mean? Because it was the whole world, against an encampment, So everybody had to have a certain amount, I think, a regiment to defend the encampment. So you
Could
had
be.
To know, so you had to know your neighbor, and you had to know they had your back.
Yeah.
So when one was going out, it must have been a sight.
He's making sure they see it. God wants them to understand the symbolism of what's happening in Jerusalem. Remember, keep in mind, that's what this is portraying. So that they will understand, those in exile will understand what's coming and what's going to happen. Because it will happen during their lifetime, in just a few short years relative to this timing. And people will come and tell them, this is what happened. And they're going to say, oh, this is what Ezekiel told us. This was God's word being fulfilled. So if we keep going on, let's pick up again in verse 8. We get the rest of it, or what it's supposed to recognize, and then we'll look at another passage in Jeremiah. Begin in verse 8. In the morning the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, did not the rebellious house of Israel ask you, what are you doing? Somebody probably did. Why are you digging a hole in the wall? That's not a good idea. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. This oracle concerns the prince in Jerusalem and the whole house of Israel who are there. Say to them, I am assigned to you. As I have done, so it will be done to them. They will go into exile as captives. The prince among them will put his things on his shoulder at dusk and leave, and a hole will be dug in the wall for him to go through. He will cover his face so that he cannot see the land. I will spread my net for him, and he will be caught in my snare. I will bring him to Babylonia, the land of the Chaldeans, but he will not see it, and there he will die. I will scatter to the winds all those around him, his staff and all his troops, and I will pursue them with the drawn sword. They will know that I am the Lord when I disperse them among the nations and scatter them through the countries. But I will spare a few of them from the sword, famine, and plague, so that in the nations where they go, they may acknowledge all their detestable practices, and they will know that I am the Lord. Okay, so again, this action, packing and digging through the wall and mimicking escaping and going out at night, is meant to portray what's happening in Israel. And he says this concerns the prince of Israel and those in Jerusalem. Kind of do the back end first. Those in Jerusalem, the people more broadly, many will go as exiles into captivity. Remember, what's happening in Jerusalem? It's going to be destroyed. Okay? Babylon's already taken the city, all right? They're in control politically of Israel. Okay? They've left the king in place, and we've had 2 or 3 actually come through the line while they've had this association, if you will. But the time is coming when Babylon's done. Israel continues to rebel. They're going to siege the city. They're going to break down the walls. They're going to burn the temple. Okay, that's coming. That's what he's talking about. So the prince, if you will, that will leave. And the people will also leave, some being taken into captivity. For purpose God's trying to teach them. Okay? Remember, this phrase occurs about 64 or 65 times. I think that's the right number. I have to go back and look at lesson 1. It occurs a lot throughout this book. God's teaching them, reminding them He is the sovereign. That's the purpose of all this. One of the main purposes. Now the prince. The prince.
Jeff,
Yep.
I know it's minor. I can't help but see that God's the object lesson, the importance of us doing things so people see, not just to be seen,
Good point.
but it's not just always a telling. It's a doing and a showing. And that's how God chose to work.
Yep. And with many of the prophets, these symbolic actions, I want you to see and understand. And something we mentioned last week when Lee made, told him from the beginning, as he established his covenant relationship with them. This is how we will interact. This is the boundaries of our relationship. And when you choose to leave or despise the relationship, there's consequences. They're going to see them. And one of the, to carry that just a point farther, we'll see much further into the book, these actions are not just for Israel. They're also lessons for the nations. God is displaying His power and His might for all to see when He brings about the destruction of the other nations as well and takes them into captivity. This point guys don't pick up on when we're studying, maybe we don't emphasize it enough. You know, most of these nations, were polytheistic. They knew of a lot of gods. Well, Jehovah was one they knew of. They just chose not to accept Him as the one true God. But they knew about it. And these lessons periodically reminded them, no, there is another more powerful God. But it doesn't stick. And we'll get some of the application of it later. Things don't always stick with us either. Moving through. Good point. Okay, so this prince. So here's the test of your history knowledge. Now, do you remember the kings of Israel? Well, the kings of Judah, technically. And who does this remind you of any of them? You remember the stories, particularly toward the end of the kingdom. Because that's exactly it's studied believe what we're referring to. Turn over to Jeremiah chapter 52. I mentioned early on that there's a lot of crossover with Jeremiah and Ezekiel since they're contemporaries. We're going to pick up in verse 4 of chapter 52. You can also find similar accounts in the Kings, but I just chose this passage to read. 52, picking up at verse 4. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with the whole army. They camped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through and the whole army fled. They left the city at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued King Zedekiah and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah in the land of Hamath, where he pronounced sentence on him. There at Riblah, the king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. He also killed all the officials of Judah. Then he put out Zedekiah's eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon, where he put him in prison till the day of his death. Sort of lines up pretty well. The prince will leave Jerusalem at night. He will leave through a hole in the wall. He will be captured by the Babylonians. I'm babbling about the Babylonians. He will be taken to Babylon, but he will not see it, and he will die in Babylon. Right, if you're a Paul Harvey fan, here's the rest of the story. And if we put the history together with the symbolic action of Ezekiel, again, Ezekiel's telling the exiles, this is what's going to happen. And then we see, in just a short period of time, relatively speaking, for them, the prince leaves. The city is destroyed. He's captured, eyes are put out, taken to Babylon, and he dies in Babylon. Now the question mark, we don't see in Ezekiel Zedekiah's actual name. Okay, so I will leave some room for those, well, I'm just not sure. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Good evidence. Good evidence. In my opinion, it seems to fulfill what he's talking about in carrying it forward. If it's not Zedekiah, I got no idea who it would be.
There's also some interesting parallels between this and the destruction in AD 70. The time to, quote, fight for Jerusalem was in their faithfulness to the Lord. If they had simply turned to the Lord would have preserved Jerusalem in both instances. But in both instances, he had already sent himself out of town through the gospel and the disciples and the scattering of everyone in the New Testament, but through the initial exile here. And yet there was a rebellion by a king fighting alone without God, thinking that he was preserving the city, even though it was already a foregone conclusion. They were not fighting on behalf of the Lord. They were not doing things his way. And the time to, quote, fight for it had long since passed. Good point. And that, consistent with what we were looking at last week, these leaders, this is ours now. The others are gone, so it's ours to take care of. Our possession, our belongings, our land. And we'll fight for it. And again, I'm not a huge military strategist, but you got to think through these things. And you've got Babylon, who has conquered most of the known world at that point for them, and they're continuing on. They're continuing to conquer. And you're one city with, I don't even know, I can't even guess what the size of the army would be at this point. Very small, again. We kind of maybe take for granted the whole army. Okay. I don't know how big the army of Babylon was at that point in time, but I'm guessing it was pretty good size. Okay, they just besieged the city. You know, they can wait them out, and they do, and then they ultimately destroy them. Matt?
It seems to me throughout history that this is an encouragement for Christians in the sense that, you know, obviously you don't follow the word, you're probably going to come apart in hard times. But if you stand on the word, it's amazing how even today a society will attack the word. They won't so much attack the Christian. They'll attack the Christian by demoralizing us, saying, "See, you couldn't even hold up to this standard, you know, to a certain extent."
Sure.
But all God asks us to do is stand. And throughout the Bible, there's many stories of encouragement where God uses their plots, their schemes, to their demise.
Right. Trust and obey. Yeah. Says, this is the word, follow me, stand with me. Now, there will still be hard times, but the big difference is the strength to go through them and to know that God has a purpose. God doesn't act without purpose.
Yeah. I didn't say any of that was easy.
No, I agree. Yeah. And again, I keep pointing this out as we go along. What's the purpose? What's the purpose? He wants his people to know, to understand. The words are important. When I tell you something, you can believe it, you can trust it, you can live in it. And that includes the consequences. You know, when I say this and you don't, there's a consequence for it. Yeah. We can trust it. We can trust it. I haven't mentioned in several weeks, I was thinking about this the other night, for the exiles, one of the key lessons I believe Ezekiel is teaching, God is teaching through Ezekiel to those in captivity. They've got no other choice. Depend on me. You have to depend on God. Your life completely, through all its phases, through everything, good and bad, that's coming along. Depend on God.
When Jesus, looked at Pilate, looked him in the eye and said, "My kingdom is not of this world," but if it was of this world, my disciples would fight. Yeah. And yet you look at the history after Jesus, and you have the Holy Roman Empire, and you have armies of the popes, and you have the Crusades, and all of this warfare, physical warfare going on, and Jesus denounced it from the start. This is not how this battle is going to be waged. And, Christians need to learn that lesson and understand that this is not a physical battle that we're in. Right. And it never was intended to be. We are, what's the saying, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. Yes. Your lesson from a couple of weeks ago, about the spiritual world around us. It's there. We're just not quite attuned to it. That's where part of that strength comes from, that endurance, because there's so much more. There's something else. And we don't always get it. But God's word, trust. Depend on me, things are coming through. Well, he's 100% right. But yet, that spiritual affects our physical. Mm-hmm. And if it's hard to trust God in good times. That's why we get bad times. It's to wake us up and bring us back. If we could trust God when everything was smooth, we wouldn't be going through the garbage. So that why does God allow suffering? To test us, to find out where we are. Yeah. So we sometimes like the bad times because they make us stronger and help us to remember who He is. So it's not a trust in bad times. Learn to trust in all times.
All times, right. And that's something we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still working on the book right now. I'm still trying to get there. The practice of living with God through all. And I think we framed it a few weeks ago. It's about that maturation, that transformation. As I grow closer to Him in all times, that awareness is there. And not to be, I hope this doesn't come across as crass, but from a marketing perspective, we would call it top of mind. That God is always there. It's always at the forefront of thinking and direction. It becomes second nature. It becomes who we are. That's part of our transformation. That awareness of Him, of His presence, is with us at all times. Okay. One more element in this passage, one more symbolic act in chapter 12. It's a short one. And it goes back to the point I made earlier about the rest of the people, the exiles leaving. Let's pick up at verse 17 of chapter 12 in Ezekiel. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, tremble as you eat your food, and shudder in fear as you drink your water. Say to the people of the land, this is what the sovereign Lord says about those living in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel. They will eat their food in anxiety and drink their water in despair, for their land will be stripped of everything in it because of the violence of all who live there. The inhabited towns will be laid waste, and the land will be desolate. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So, basically, eat like you're afraid. What's happening at the end of this siege, if you think about the end of that period, is they're breaking down the walls, the army is fleeing. They're out of food. Okay, he's saying, this is what, for the exiles, this is what's happening in Jerusalem. This is what they will experience. And he's symbolizing the fear of the Jews during the siege. And catch that last part. This is so you will know, you exiles, so you will know I am the Lord. Because think about what's going to happen. We'll see later in some later chapters. And I don't know how many because there's no record. But it seems like some of the exiles those in the last siege, when Jerusalem is destroyed, the walls are broken, the temple's burned, some of those are also taken to captivity. Okay, so some of those folks, it seems like they're going to make their way into Babylon, they're going to be able to tell firsthand what's happened. And now those in Babel are going to say, oh, the word of the Lord has been fulfilled. Okay, again, for the exiles, this is so you will know. You're not going to see it. They're not going to be there for the destruction. But when the word comes, when some of those that did experience come, again, they can believe. Their belief can be strengthened. They can put more trust. Hopefully they'll put their trust in the Lord. And because we know the end of the story, some do. They do go back. They do return to the relationship. Okay, finishing out the rest of chapter 28, there's a couple of things Ezekiel's got to deal with. And I've framed it attitude toward God's prophecies, or attitudes towards God's prophecies. Let's pick up in verse 21, chapter 12. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, what is this proverb you have in the land of Israel? The days go by and every vision comes to nothing. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am going to put an end to this proverb, and they will no longer quote it in Israel. Say to them, the days are near when every vision will be fulfilled. For there will be no more false visions or flattering divinations among the people of Israel. But I, the Lord, will speak what I will, and it shall be fulfilled without delay. For in your days, you rebellious house, I will fulfill whatever I say, declares the sovereign Lord. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, the house of Israel is saying, the vision he sees is for many years from now, and he prophesies about the distant future. Therefore say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, none of my words will be delayed any longer. Whatever I say will be fulfilled, declares the sovereign Lord. Maybe this is my warped way of thinking, but I believe there's at least two attitudes or two ideas about God's prophecies, about prophets that are conveyed in these verses. So think about this way. Ezekiel was brought into captivity, lived there for about 5 years, and then God puts his message into him, and he starts speaking. And he can only speak when God gives him a message to speak, at least during this period of time. So how do you respond if you're one of the people listening to exile, to Ezekiel, seeing these messages? And what choices do you have? Ezekiel's doing some of these crazy things, and he's telling you these words of the Lord. Basically, I have three choices. That finger doesn't work. I'm going to do it this way. Three choices. Okay. You can believe it. You can ignore it. That's the one people most of the time don't think about. You can ignore it. You can say that's just not right. That's just not right. I think this is one of the issues he's dealing with. Saying, no, you, claiming to be God's prophet, your message is not right. We're going to believe other prophets. We're going to believe what somebody else says. We're not going to believe what you say. We don't think it's the true word. In Ezekiel, this is not quite as apparent because Ezekiel is the prophet that we're reading about and the messages God's giving to him. Go back into Kings and Chronicles and Jeremiah, it's very apparent. And we know from the history and the history books, the Israelites did not always want to hear the messages of rebuke. They did not want to hear about coming judgment or punishment. So they believed the false prophets.
But Jeff, it totally makes sense though. They're so far off track.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for the people who are telling them what they want to hear. Kind of like your simple
Yes.
today.
Yes.
They're not willing to look at the truth. They just want to feel better.
Yes. I believe in the New Testament we talk about itching ears. We want to hear what we want to hear. And he's going to come back to that point. He's going to bring it back again to them and point out this is part of your problem. You're not willing to listen to what God says. You're only focused on what you want or your desire. Your focus. So that's one of the first challenges. Okay, they just don't choose to believe it. It's not the right word. It's not truth. The second one, they're related. They say, well, maybe it is, but it's down the road. So it won't happen in our time. That's the distant future. We're not going to worry about it. That proverb, remember, says the days go by and every vision comes to nothing. Well, I'm going to put an end to that proverb. That's pretty strong. I like that. You won't be saying this anymore after God fulfills his words. He clarifies that his words will not be delayed, the words will be fulfilled. And again, the purpose, to confirm for the people. Remember this, we've come many generations since Mount Sinai when God spoke to the people when they saw his presence on the mountain, when they were given the law, given the covenant relationship. He's brought them back full circle. I'm going to tell you stuff, you've got to believe it. Trust it. Trust and obey. And then I'm with you. And the purpose is for me to bless you. That's what he's trying to do. In chapter 13, we continue to deal with this idea of struggling against the truth and believing God's messages versus the false prophets and the message that they want to deal with. I'm not going to take time to read all of 13 since we're running short this morning, but if you look at verses 1 through 7, you get what I've called here the problem of the false prophets. Okay, and this is a trouble for Israel throughout their history, as we're talking about just a minute ago. You go back to Deuteronomy 13, all the way back, before they go into the land. God's telling them this is going to be a problem. They were warned that there's going to be false prophets. And there will be a test. They're a test. Are you going to trust me? Are you going to believe the truth of God? Or are you going to accept what you want, what you think is right? 1 Kings 22, I think, is a good example of this. If you go back and read that particular passage, you may remember the story. Period of the divided kingdom. King Ahab in the north, King Jehoshaphat in the south. Related by marriage. That's not a good idea, to be related to Ahab. But that's a side note. So King Ahab's trying to convince King Jehoshaphat, let's go to war against Aram. Aram is bothering Israel, the northern kingdom. Let's go to war. Jehoshaphat says, well, what does God say? What do the prophets tell us? So Ahab brings in his 400 prophets and tells them all, go to war, you're going to win. And Jehoshaphat's pretty smart. He says, well, is there not a prophet of the Lord? And again, the things that stick in my mind, the little details they don't pick up on. Okay? You get all these men prophesying. How does he know they're not all prophets of the Lord? I have no idea. But he recognizes these are not prophets of the Lord. So let's find a prophet of the Lord. And there's one. Ahab doesn't like him. Why do you like him? Because he's going to tell you stuff you don't want to hear. That you all are wrong. You've been wrong from the beginning. Go back to your first king. He messed it up. And you all continue to mess it up. And there's judgment and punishment coming. And we don't want to hear that. But that's what Micaiah tells him. Yeah, go to war and you're going to be destroyed. You, Ahab, will die as a result of this. Not what they want to hear. Okay? So again, the false prophets, not unusual for them. Okay? Not unusual at all. And in the days of Ezekiel, and we still have false prophecy. Now, if you're in Jerusalem at this time, okay, we'll pick a period. You're under the rule of King Zedekiah, okay, the last king. What would be the message the false prophet is going to tell you? If you're in Jerusalem and you're listening to the false prophets before Babylon comes in and destroys you.
God's going to save you. God's going to preserve Jerusalem.
That's right.
God's going to fight for you.
King of Babylon's going to be defeated, even though he hasn't been yet. The exiles would return, the Jewish kingdom would be restored, all is good. If that's what they're hearing. That's the false prophecy in Jerusalem. If you're in exile, you're hearing the same thing, with a slightly different twist. Okay, you're going to get to go back. Okay, Jerusalem will be restored. You as God's people will be restored. Babylon, the king of Babylon, will be defeated. And it's okay. That's the false prophecies. Then you get Jeremiah. Again, the crossover. We'll take time to read Jeremiah 29. I've got the passages listed for you. This is his letter to the exiles. If you're not familiar with that part of Jeremiah, I wasn't. I had to go back and reread it. You know what Jeremiah tells the exiles? What's his message to the exiles? What do you think is his message to the exiles? You can go ahead and say it, G. God's told Jeremiah what to say. He writes the letter to him.
Well, he basically tells him that God's got a plan for you.
Got a plan for you. What are you supposed to do?
Wait on the Lord.
Wait on it. Settle in. Build your homes. Farm your fields. Raise your livestock. Live. Follow God. Because you're going to be here a while. 70 years. You're going to be here a while. Settle in. That's the message they're getting from the prophet. It's not even there. And Ezekiel's going to tell them the same thing. With various visions and symbols. Settle in. Be here. Trust in God. Because it's going to happen. This is where you're going to be. The other part of chapter 13, let me jump back to Ezekiel. These false prophets that God is condemning. And God is speaking through Jeremiah and said, this is the problem. These false prophets are giving you these messages that are contrary to his word, to my word, and you're listening to them. You've got to stop because they're going to be destroyed. They also will be condemned. They also are condemned. He characterizes them as jackals. Okay, these false prophets are like jackals among the ruins. Not an animal I think very often about, I'll be honest. When you think of a jackal, what kind of imagery does that bring to mind for you? What's a jackal do?
Scavenger.
It's a scavenger.
Remaining flesh off the bones.
Yeah. And that's what these false prophets are. They're just trying to focus on their own interest to survive. I'm going to say what you want to hear so you'll provide for me, so that you'll reward me, so that you'll take care of me. Instead of a prophet providing the message that the people need to hear to build them up, and we're going to see the wall imagery in the next couple of chapters. It starts here and it continues on. These messages should be building up the people, supporting them. But instead, the jackals are just scavenging and tearing down, doing the exact opposite of what God would expect or want for them. And if you are one of these false prophets, as you look at verses 8 through 16 of chapter 13, it's not a good place to be, not a good space to be in. God's judgment against these false prophets in chapter 13. We've talked previously about the threefold punishment of God, the sword, plague, and famine. He's got a threefold punishment for the false prophets too. They're going to lose their place of honor in the assembly. Your translations may talk about they're going to lose their place in the council. Okay? When they're telling people what they want to hear, telling the leaders what they want to hear, they're trusted. They're advisors to the leaders. God says they're going to lose that. Their names will be removed from the civil registry. That's going to be important for their family line, because if they were ever to go back, they couldn't receive their land, because now they're no longer accepted, they're no longer documented. Remember when we go back, remember the day of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, how important it was for them to be able to prove their lineage. Now these folks are taken out of the lineage. They have no proof. And they're not going back anyway. I mentioned just a minute ago the wall imagery. And we see that again in verse 13, in chapter 13. These false prophets are illustrated as weak walls covered with whitewash. They appear to be strong. They appear to be strong. Look good on the outside, nothing on the inside. That imagery is going to continue on in the New Testament as well. We'll make some of those connections next week. We'll come back to some of this. But I want to close out with chapter 13, verses 10 through 16. Again, God's words about these false prophets and their ultimate destruction. And what they're, quote-unquote, building up, he will break down. He will destroy. Actually, pick up in verse 13. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In my wrath I will unleash a violent wind, and in my anger hailstones and torrents of rain will fall with destructive fury. I will tear down the wall you have covered with whitewash and will level it to the ground so that its foundation will be laid bare. When it falls, you will be destroyed in it, and you will know that I am the Lord. So I will pour out my wrath against the wall and against those who covered it with whitewash. I will say to you, the wall is gone, and so are those who whitewashed it. Those prophets of Israel who prophesied to Jerusalem and saw visions of peace for her when there was no peace, declares the sovereign Lord. Well, God's not very keen on these false prophets and the messages and the truths they're giving to them. And this is one group of false prophets. We'll pick up with the rest of chapter 13 next week. There's a second group, which we often don't think about. And God's going to condemn the prophetesses, okay, the ladies that are also engaged in false prophecy. So we'll pick up with that point starting next week, and then we'll keep moving forward. Appreciate everyone, your attention and your comments, and we will carry on next Sunday.